Welcome back. It's week 5. This week and next, we're going to dive into pantheons. In order to do that, we're going to need a few new vocab words, and guess what? Your first one's already on the board. Now, the word pantheon comes from a building in ancient Greece by the same name. The Pantheon was a building devoted to all of the ancient Greek gods. From that, we get the definition that the pantheon is the collective group of gods in a religion. In order to talk about worshiping gods, I also want to make sure you have a number of other vocabulary words under your belt that all end in ism. So these are ways of thinking, as any ism is. Monotheism is the first one. Monotheism is belief in one god, from that root, mono. So, belief in a single god or higher power might include religions like the Abrahamic faiths, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. Those all believe in just one god, one deity, one higher power. Another way of believing would be polytheism. Polytheism is belief in multiple gods or higher powers. Now, polytheism might include religions like Hinduism. In Hinduism, there are many different gods that one might worship. Henotheism is a subtle variant on polytheism. Henotheism is belief in multiple gods, but with special devotion to just one. So, for example, if you were one of those ancient Egyptians and you believed in lots of different gods, you believed in Hathor and Anubis and Osiris, but you focused your devotion just to Ra, that would make you henotheistic. Pantheism is a word that means belief in a universal higher power or a force that exists within all things. One of the most famous world faiths that believes this is Taoism. Taoism believes that there is an overriding energy, a force, a power, a god in some way within all things and all people, and you can find your way to connect to that through better living. Syncretism is one of those words that refers to things syncing together, just like you might sync your phone to your computer. It is the melding of two or more belief systems into a third new belief. So it's not exactly one and it's not exactly the other. It's a third new unique thing. Lots of different faiths have elements of syncretism in them. One example of this is Sikhism. Sikhism is a religion in the world that combines elements of Islam and elements of Hinduism, but is its own third unique thing. Finally, Euhemerism. Euhemerism is named for the ancient philosopher Euhemerus. He had the skeptical notion that maybe those gods were just the deification or godification of real historic figures. They are simply exaggerations of real history. Got all your vocabulary down? Excellent. Now we're going to move into pantheons. Our lecture for this week is all about what pantheons are like in general, and then also some specifics about the pantheons of the ancient Egyptians, the ancient Greek, and the ancient Norse. Okay, here we go. For this lecture, we're going to ask you to follow along with just 4 prompts, but it's going to be a lot of information. The first is, what do all pantheons tend to have in common? The second is, what was the cultural context for the ancient Egyptians, for the ancient Greeks, and for the ancient Norse? Now, you're about to get a lot of information, and I strongly encourage you to take breaks between each section. Go grab a drink of water, take a walk, stretch your legs, whatever you need to do. That said, let's get going with our first prompt. So, what do all pantheons have in common? Well, nearly all pantheons involve family relations. In fact, they can typically be structured as a family tree. There are grandparents, usually in the form of some kind of primal beings like chaos or sky or earth. Then they give birth to a rise of gods. Those are sort of like the parents, the aunts, and the uncles. And then those gods give rise to other gods, to demigods, or to mortals, often all 3. That's sort of like the children's generation. That family tree also usually involves a patriarch and a matriarch. Last time we talked about the earth goddess or the earth mother and the supreme being as an earth and sky figure. Those are common patriarchs and matriarchs. For example, Gaia and Uranus, the earth and sky for the ancient Greeks, would fit this archetype. We also see things like Ra, the god of the sun, and Hathor, a goddess of fertility, who would fit this archetype. In addition to having that family structure, their hierarchy, that means the structure of the ways that the gods relate to each other, often reflects that of the culture worshiping them. Now, that's a complicated sentence, but what I mean is this. It's things like the ancient Egyptians were heavily concerned with who had the right to rule, who got to be the pharaoh was very important. Their life and death was tied to the Nile River. That's why, even though they were around for a very long time, they never expanded the same way other cultures did, because they needed to stay very close to that Nile, and they had a rigid class system. If you were born a pharaoh, you died a pharaoh. If you were born a serf, you died a serf. The gods were also concerned with the right to rule. They also focused on the Nile River and how it connected them to the world of the Dot, the afterlife. And they also had a rigid class system that you could not move from very easily. The Greeks, similarly, had a culture that reflected their gods and gods that reflected their culture. They had a governing council, much like a republic. They saw frequent competition for leadership and had an obsession with physical beauty and fitness. This again is true for the people and for the gods. The Norse, similarly, were not firmly organized under a single monarch. They had connected realms that formed their allies and their enemies, and they had a lifestyle of protecting their own while going out and raiding others. As a result, we see the exact same traits in the gods. They all had family relations, they had a patriarch and a matriarch, and they reflected the culture that worshipped them. Remember to pause if you need a break. This might be a good time for one of those. Now, let's focus on a few specific pantheons. The Egyptians, the Greeks, and the Norse. I'm going to give you a timeline first so you know where these fit together. The Egyptians are the oldest and longest lived of these three. They lasted nearly 3,000 years, which is a very impressive timeline. As a result, some of the stories of the ancient Egyptians vary, because just like any story that you tell, tellings will change bit by bit over time, and 3,000 years is a long time for a game of telephone. The Greeks overlap them just a little bit. The Greeks come around the end of the Egyptian era and last a little bit beyond that, but also then their stories get carried on by the Romans. You can see in that there's a little bit of a shadow of the Greeks continuing forward. That's because by the end of that time, by about the year 0, we've got Romans like Ovid and Virgil telling those same stories, but adding a Roman twist to them. Finally, we get the Norse. The Norse are the most recent of these three, and also the shortest lived. They were only around for about 200 years, starting around the year 800. And there's us right there, just after the year 2000. So, first we're going to begin is Egypt. So the Egyptians require us to go all the way back to around the year 3000. You don't need to remember a lot of specific dates. Don't worry, I'll give you a wrap-up at the end of this, but I'm going to zip you through about 3,000 years worth of Egyptian history. You're probably familiar with some of the names of the ancient Egyptian gods, Horus and Ra and Anubis. These gods were worshipped in Egypt beginning around 3000, and in fact maybe earlier than that. But 3000 gives us about the beginning of the early dynastic period. And what's important about that is it gives us the hieroglyphics that we know today. Now, hieroglyphics are the only reason that we know about these gods. It's possible that they were worshipped in just an oral tradition long before then, but hieroglyphics gave us our history. Anything before written record is what we call prehistory. After the early dynastic period, when we get those hieroglyphs, we get one of the most significant symbols of ancient Egypt, the pyramids. Those come about in what's called the Old Kingdom. Then, in the first intermediate period, we get an important moment when Mutenhotep unites the whole country. Now this is significant because often you don't get culture progressing forward if there's not a single leader in order to organize, and Mutenhotep II did just that. Following Mutenhotep, we get the Middle Kingdom, and during this time, great works are constructed, including the Temple of Karnak. By the second intermediate period, we're going to get the introduction of the chariot, which winds up being an important figure in lots of artworks in the ancient Egyptian age. The New Kingdom then introduces the Book of the Dead. Now this is one of the key sources for Egyptian myths. It was the story of what you were going to encounter after you died, how you could prepare yourself, how you could cheat your way through various different judges who were going to rate whether you were worthy of moving forward or whether you were simply going to be basically turned into mulch in the Duat and allowed to start again. After that, we get the Pharaoh Akhenaten and his wife Nefertiti. Now you've probably heard of his son, Tutankhamun, or King Tut as we know him more commonly. Akhenaten was very unpopular because he tried to shift the focus of the religion of the ancient Egyptians. Tutankhamun restored focus on Amun as the primary deity, and that was something that the Egyptians liked, so he was praised a little more highly than his father was. Moving forward, we get the Third Intermediate Period, and during this time, Egypt breaks up. Upper and Lower Egypt split again into two different kingdoms, and so we start to see actually the decline of Egypt. Right after that happens, because of that shift in power, we get Egypt conquered by Nubians, Assyrians, and Persians, and we get a fall eventually to the Greco-Roman Ptolemy. The Rosetta Stone is one of the reasons that we are able to understand ancient Egyptian hieroglyphics, and it comes about in the Ptolemaic period because Ptolemy wanted people to understand his rulings, and so he put out big giant lists of the rules that people needed to know, and he wrote them in ancient Greek, in Demotic, and in hieroglyphic. And because of those three things, we got a key to understanding what those hieroglyphs actually mean. Otherwise, they might have been lost to history, and we would never know. Following Ptolemy, we get the Roman and Byzantine era around 30 BCE, and one of the most famous figures, Cleopatra. You've probably heard that name before. It's worth noting that Cleopatra lived closer to you than she did to the building of the pyramids. That's how long it's been for this massive chunk of time that we would consider the Egyptian era. Okay, here's what you should take away from the Egyptians. They are the oldest and longest lived of the three pantheons that I'm talking to you about, ranging roughly 3,000 years. Hieroglyphic records are the reasons that we are able to understand many of the stories about these gods, and the Rosetta Stone provided the key to reading this language. Here's another good time to pause if you need to take a quick break, and then let's get back into it. We've got to go back now in order to go forward, because the Greeks overlap the Egyptians just a little bit. So now let's back up to around 1200. The ancient Greeks are figures like Zeus and Poseidon and Athena. Right? These are gods whose names you've probably heard. They're very popular in Western culture. But I want you to understand the people worshipping the ancient Greek gods also. So, we're going to talk about the development of Greek society beginning before ancient Greece. Around 1200, we get what's called the Mycenaean era, or the Mycenaean Empire. In Mycenae, there were various different city-states, and we get a very important period in 1200 when the Trojan War takes place. And I'm sure you've heard of that. It's the main topic of the Iliad and what Odysseus is coming home from in the Odyssey. Now, the Trojan War was hugely significant. It was this massive war that united lots of different Mycenaean groups. And then after that, we saw a period of chaos. Those various different troops were all finding their way back. It wasn't well organized, and so we get fighting between states. And that's not a good time to make art. During this time, people were just working on surviving. But, bit by bit, the polis, or the city-states, got stronger. And so we saw the rise of places like Sparta and Athens and Crete to being stronger and stronger kingdoms. When you've got a stronger kingdom, you can then organize under a single ruler, and you have time to do things like make art and tell stories. So around 800, we get this guy named Homer going around telling stories of the Trojan War, and suddenly we begin to unite as a single Greece. From there, we get the monarchy. With the monarchy, we've got a single power who has the right to rule. Now, that can be a good thing. Like we talked about with the Egyptians, it means that there's a centralized power, and they can get things done, like building great works and commissioning art. But it's not always a great thing because they have the right to rule, therefore they can do whatever they want, whether or not they care about the common people. Monarchies generally evolve into oligarchies. That's when you split up the monarchy between multiple different children of a single king. But oligarchies, again, are not ideal. What often happened in oligarchies, and what definitely happened for the ancient Greeks, was that certain generals would rise up and say, no, I don't like what this king is doing, so instead I'm going to unite, but I'm going to use the power of the military in order to have the right to rule. Now, this was good in some ways. They represented the people who were more common in many ways, but they held rule through might and through violence, which meant that often they were what we now understand as tyrannical. These tyrants eventually gave way to democracy. Democracy in ancient Greece was a far cry from modern democracy, but it's the basic model on which our system is based. Now, we see this reflected in the gods as well. The gods get together on Mount Olympus and have votes and decide what they're going to do. Well, ancient Greece followed what the gods were modeling and became more democratic, but the gods also followed what the ancient Greeks were doing in the ways in which they tell their stories. So, around 800 again, Homer is telling stories of these ancient Greeks, And that becomes the stories that unite them as one single group, the ancient Greeks as we know them today. The takeaways that I want you to get from Greece are that they went from a time of turmoil to a time of order, prosperity, and art. The political structures at the time led to sharing those myths, and the myths then influenced their sense of shared political identity. And finally, they developed a republic and democracy, and the gods reflect that culture. And one more time, you might need to pause. Okay, time for another wibbly-wobbly time hop as we jump forward now to the Norse. The Norse give us figures like Odin, Thor, Loki, and Freya. The Norse were going to begin around 800, but before then, around 700 Common Era. The Norse are mostly farmers. During this time, there's no overall king, so they're not strongly organized under any one person. But in 793, we begin the age of the Vikings. Now, the Vikings raid a monastery in Lindisfarne, England, and they take silver and gold, and they go back home and live like kings. While their neighbors who are toiling away in the cold soil trying to still be farmers, look at those people who had just gone off and taken what they wanted, and they get jealous. And so we begin raids in other areas, like Scotland and Ireland. And fairly soon into the 9th century, that becomes the culture of the Vikings. Raid, raid, raid. By 832, they raided a place called Armagh in Ireland 3 times in just 1 month. In 834, they raided Dorestad. In 835, they raided Dorestad. In 836, Dorestad. 837, Dorestad. During this time, Dorestad begins to strongly dislike the Norse. By 844, they made it into Spain. By 845, they raided Hamburg and Paris. Now, these are massive, big cities, and they are not on the banks of any particular ocean. They, in fact, are fairly inland. The only reason that the Norse are able to do this are because of their ships. They have longboats that are able to travel both overseas and through relatively shallow waters like the River Seine. By 859, they're on their way into the Mediterranean. By 870, they've gone into Iceland and kicked the Irish monks out of a settlement there. By 914, they conquered one of the biggest political structures of the time, Brittany. And then into the 10th century, there are war and treaties, and still no single recognized Norse ruler. For the Norse, not having a single ruler actually worked in their favor. It meant that it was harder to pin down who these Norse raiders were, where they were going to come from next. It was like fighting hornets instead of fighting one single bear. By 965, we get an important, significant figure named Harald Bluetooth. Now, that Bluetooth, sure enough, is the same name for when you're trying to pair your earbuds and your cell phone. The HB for Harald Bluetooth, in fact, makes the symbol that you might be familiar with on your phone. Harald Bluetooth was famous because at that time he was beginning to convert many Danes and other Scandinavians to Christianity. That's going to come up significantly with one of the figures, Olaf Tryggvason, who winds up converting soon after. Moving on, by 980, Norse raids in England resume, and by 983, Eric the Red, a very famous figure, settles in Greenland. He's going to have a son named Leif. We'll watch for him in a moment. By 994, there's that Olaf Tryggvason. He's baptized as a Christian, thanks to Harald Bluetooth's efforts, and then he unites Norway. So we've finally got a king of Norway for the first time in any real significant way. But it's also the end of the Viking Age. So with the unification of Norway under a Christian king, we see a shift away from the old gods and toward Christianity. Part of this is very intentional. Olaf Tryggvason, for instance, funds Leif Erikson. Now, Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, goes around to various different places, including what we now call North America, which they called Vinland, and he spreads Christianity as a way of funding his efforts. So, by the year 1000, Norway and Iceland are officially Christian. Taking a look at those points of interest from beginning at 793 with those sea raids all the way up to about the year 1000, we can see that there's only about 200 years of Viking Age. And the one other date that I'm going to put up there is 1222. About 200 years later, Snorri Sturluson finally writes down the Prose Edda, the Tales of Norse Mythology. Now, because there was no king to commission anything like this before then, it's 200 years after the end of the Viking Age before we have any kind of comprehensive Bible of Norse works. What you should take away from this is that the Vikings were raiders who never had a single unified king until the end of their era. Their stories were therefore not organized or preserved by any official, well-funded kingdom, and our records were collected hundreds of years later from sources all over the world where they traveled. That's a lot of information. To wrap up all of that, nearly all pantheons have family relations. They tend to have a patriarch and a matriarch. The gods reflect the cultures worshipping them. The Egyptians were the oldest of those three. They were concerned with the right to rule and with the afterlife, which we know thanks to hieroglyphs. The Greeks overlapped the end of the Egyptians, emerging in a chaotic period, and their stories reflect that shift to order and diplomacy. And the Norse were the most recent and also the most brief. They lacked any one single leader, and that meant that the Vikings spread their stories all over, but without one official version. Okay. Hopefully you got all of that information down and you're ready to move into the Pantheon project next. Any information you need for that you can find in the Google Classroom. If you need any help, of course see me during class, shoot me an email, or come visit me during my office hours. Until next time, take care.